We tend to think of history, especially military history, as this grand drama of brilliant generals, heroic soldiers, and decisive battles. But what if I told you that one of the most important stories of World War II wasn't written on a battlefield, but on a spreadsheet? Today, we're going to pull back the curtain on a different kind of weapon. We're talking about boring, bureaucratic paperwork, shipping manifests, supply logs, that ended up telling a story so powerful, so undeniable, that it predicted the downfall of the Third Reich long before the war was actually over. This is the story of how simple arithmetic became a prophecy of defeat. So let's go back in time. I want you to picture the scene. It's November 1943 in Berlin. We're deep inside the Bendler Block, which is basically the Pentagon of the German army, the absolute nerve center of their war effort. Imagine a cramped, smoke-filled office. The air is heavy, not just with smoke, but with this palpable tension. And in that room, two of Germany's sharpest military analysts are about to stumble upon a truth that will completely shatter every single thing their leaders believe about the war.
You're looking at the words of Colonel Reinhard Galen. Now, you have to understand, this wasn't just a casual remark. This was a desperate plea. Galen, along with his counterpart Colonel Alexis von Rohn, they're staring at a stack of captured American supply reports from the Italian front, and their faces are just white. Because these documents, these seemingly boring pieces of paper, are filled with numbers, and these numbers aren't just large, they're apocalyptic. They're so unbelievably huge that for an entire week, these two men, two of the best minds in German intelligence, have tried everything they can to prove them wrong, and they've failed. The numbers are real.
It sounds kind of crazy, right? How could a bunch of shipping forms, of all things, tell you a war is lost? Well, to really get the sheer earth-shattering shock these analysts felt, we have to step into the mindset of the German high command. We need to understand the world as they saw it and grasp the absolutely fundamental, catastrophic mistake they made about their enemy, the United States. All right, Section 1, the Great American Miscalculation. This whole thing really boils down to ideology versus reality. You see, the German leadership, all the way up to Hitler himself, was completely blinded by their own propaganda. They had this core belief, this unshakable assumption, that America was just soft. They saw it as this decadent, lazy, consumer-obsessed country full of jazz music and refrigerators, totally incapable of the kind of discipline and sacrifice needed to fight a real, total war.
Now, historians argue about whether Hermann Goering actually said these exact words, but honestly, it doesn't even matter, because the sentiment was 100% real. This quote, whoever said it, perfectly captures the absolute contempt the Nazi elite had for America. They looked at their own war machine, an industry they'd been building and perfecting since 1933, and they thought it was invincible. How could a nation of, shopkeepers and car salesmen possibly stand up to that?
At this slide, this right here shows their fatal mistake. It's an incredible irony. The Germans looked at America in the 1930s, and all they saw was the Great Depression, unemployment, closed factories, economic weakness. But what they failed to see was that all that idle capacity, all those silent factories, they were like a giant coiled spring. America had this enormous reserve of industrial power just sitting there, waiting to be unleashed. Germany, on the other hand, was already running at 110%. Their spring was already fully uncoiled. They had nothing left in reserve.
So, you can imagine what happened when President Roosevelt stood up in 1940 and promised to build 50,000 airplanes a year. In Berlin, they didn't just doubt him. They laughed out loud. To them, it was completely absurd. I mean, think about it. In 1939, the entire U.S. had produced less than 3,000 military planes. And now their president was promising a nearly 60-fold increase. They dismissed it as ridiculous American propaganda. And that was a mistake that was going to cost them absolutely everything. Because that supposedly impossible fantasy was about to show up in Berlin, not as propaganda, but as cold, hard, undeniable data. And it came from the most unlikely of sources, captured logistics forms from a single American Army Corps fighting in Italy. The most mundane, boring paperwork you can imagine. The first number that hit those German analysts like a physical blow was fuel. 3.2 million gallons of gasoline, plus another 800,000 gallons of diesel. Now, let me be clear, this wasn't for the whole Allied army in Italy. This wasn't even for an entire army. This was for one single corps, in one single month. For a German officer who had to plan every single operation around crippling fuel shortages, a number like this wasn't just big, it was obscene. It felt like it came from another planet.
And here's where it gets truly insane. The analysts in Berlin put this number into context. They did the math, and what they found was that a single U.S. corps, about 80,000 men, was getting more fuel every month than the entire German Army Group Center on the Eastern Front. That's a force of over 500,000 men, fighting the biggest, most important battles of the entire war. We're not just talking about a small advantage here. This is a totally different kind of warfare. It meant American tanks could move whenever they wanted, and German panzers had to sit and wait for the fuel truck.
And the horror show for these analysts didn't stop with fuel. Next, they looked at the ammunition requisitions. The paperwork showed that the same American Corps, in that same routine month, received 15,000 tons of artillery ammunition. And I have to stress this. This wasn't for a huge special offensive. This was just their regular monthly delivery. This was business as usual. How does that compare? Well, a German corps of the same size would be considered lucky to get 2,000 tons. The Americans were firing shells at more than 7 times the rate of the Germans. But here's the crucial part. It was sustainable. They could do it month after month after month. It meant that any German tactical skill, any bravery on the part of their soldiers, was simply being erased, drowned in an endless sea of American steel. So let's zoom out from that one corpse in Italy and look at the big picture. By 1943, the national production numbers tell an even more terrifying story. For every single tank Germany managed to build, America was churning out more than 3. For every one advanced fighter plane that rolled out of a German factory, America was building over 4. And you have to remember, Germany was pushing its industry to the absolute breaking point, and they were still being lapped. Every battle they won was just a tactical victory, but they were losing the strategic war on the assembly lines of Detroit and Kansas. This industrial power meant that even Germany's main strategy at sea, using U-boats to starve Britain into submission, was mathematically doomed. Now, sure, building a massive cargo ship in under 5 days was a bit of a publicity stunt, but the reality behind it was terrifying for the Germans. American shipyards were launching new ships more than 7 times faster than all of Germany's U-boats could sink them. You see, the Battle of the Atlantic wasn't ultimately won by warships and destroyers. It was being won by welders in American shipyards. Okay, so back to Berlin. It's now December 1943. Colonels Galen and von Rönne, armed with all this undeniable, terrifying data, did their duty. They put it all together, the fuel, the ammo, the tanks, the ships, into a single, comprehensive, brutally honest report for the German High Command. They laid out in black and white the simple arithmetic of their own defeat.
Their conclusion was professional, it was objective, and it was absolutely inescapable. They said, look, this war isn't about tactics anymore. It's a war of factories. It's a contest of industrial attrition. And we are losing, badly. They predicted the gap was only going to get wider, that soon the Allies would have at least a 3-to-1 advantage in everything. And then came the final gut punch of a sentence. Military victory, they wrote, was mathematically impossible.
So what happened when this bombshell of a report landed on Hitler's desk? Was there a debate? A reconsideration of strategy? No. The response was immediate, and it was total denial. Hitler himself dismissed it as defeatist propaganda. He and his inner circle just refused to believe it. They chose to believe that their willpower, their supposedly superior German spirit, could somehow overcome the cold, hard logic of basic math.
What happened here is a textbook and absolutely catastrophic example of confirmation bias. You know what that is, right? It's our human tendency to look for information that proves what we already believe and to ignore anything that challenges us. The Nazi leadership had built their entire world on a story of their own superiority. And when these analysts presented them with data, with facts that completely contradicted that story, they didn't question the story. They attacked the data. The numbers didn't fit their narrative, so they decided the numbers must be a lie. Now, it's easy to look back at this as just a crazy story from 80 years ago. But the reason we're talking about it today is that the lessons from these ignored reports are incredibly powerful, and they are absolutely timeless. They go way beyond the battlefield and speak directly to how we make decisions in our own lives, in our businesses, and in our societies today. So what can we take away from these dusty old logbooks? Well, first, that logistics is destiny. A brilliant plan is totally useless if you can't get the supplies to the right place at the right time. Second, data has to win out over dogma. We have to be willing to listen to objective analysis, even when it tells us something we don't want to hear. Third, never, ever underestimate your competition based on your own biases. It is the fastest way to get yourself into serious trouble. And maybe the most important lesson of all, arithmetic always wins. In the end, reality doesn't care about your beliefs or how much willpower you have. The numbers are the numbers. And that brings us to the final and maybe most uncomfortable question of all. One for you, for me, for all of us. Where in our own lives, in our work, in the policies we support, where are we letting our own cherished beliefs blind us to the actual math on the page? When are we ignoring an inconvenient reality, just hoping that if we wish hard enough, the numbers will change? It's a question worth thinking long and hard about, because as this story proves, the price for ignoring the arithmetic of reality is always, eventually, catastrophic.